Hello and welcome back to Our Bookshop in Tring. I'm Ben Moorhouse and this is our third author interview. We're talking to Roger Moorhouse today. Roger is the eminent historian. His last book, First to Fight, was published last year, middle of last year, and he came to the book festival in November actually to talk about that. What we're talking about today is Hitler's Third Reich in 100 Objects. That was published 3 years ago, but it's literally just come out in paperback, and I can't recommend it enough. I was fortunate enough to have a chat with Roger this morning, and so I have the strange circumstance of handing over to myself and Roger. Good. So I'm here with Roger. Hello, Roger. Welcome.
Hello,
to another Zoom. Thank you for doing Helen Fry the other day.
That's right.
Wonderful Zoom recording. So Roger is a Moorhouse, as am I. So can I just put one thing straight? We are not related. So Roger is a Lancastrian and I am a Yorkshireman. And indeed we are talking to each other, which is... yes, there's consensus and peace across the rose, the red rose and the white rose. So Roger is an eminent historian who has published much on Nazi Germany, and he has produced a series of books. And the one we're talking about today is called Hitler's Third Reich in 100 Objects. Fascinating book. I've actually got the hardback here, which I bought 3 years ago, and so the paperback is only literally just come out. So we've got some in the shop, and let me just read from the spine. In this groundbreaking new book, leading historian of Nazi Germany Roger Moorhouse presents a novel approach to the history of the Third Reich, framing its narrative through 100 objects. This new work provides an eclectic mix of subjects and covers all aspects of the Third Reich's history, from the well-trodden themes of the Holocaust and conflict through to less well-known topics such as social policy, technological advances, and the use of propaganda. So it's a very interesting selection of objects, which we will dip into shortly. But first question I've got for you, Roger, is what made you become a historian? What in your background defined your kind of love of history, and particularly the sort of Nazi Reich?
That's quite a good question, really. I didn't show any particular promise when I was at school. As you know, Ben, I went to school not far away, Berkhamsted. Was a fairly unspectacular pupil. Actually left school at 16, went and did various things, and then got to 1989. And 1989. I found fascinating. It was the world that we're a sort of similar age, so the world that we grew up with, which was the Cold War and the divided Europe and all of that stuff. When you grow up with it, you kind of imagine that that's how it's always going to be, that's how the world is, and it will never change. And then in 1989, you see all of that almost in a season disappeared. And I remember I was living down in Portsmouth at the time. I remember watching all of that transpire on the news every night. And I used to rush home to watch the news because I found it all so fascinating. And at the end of that year, and the last event of '89 was the fall of Ceausescu in Romania, which was very bloody, if you remember. He was executed, I think, on Christmas Day. At the end of that year, I kind of thought I was just blown away by the events, and I just thought I really want to know more about this, and I was inspired, and it was then that I applied to go to university, and I did history A level because that was kind of the subject that I half enjoyed at school at least, and just sort of essentially rode the wave of that fascination from 1989. Went to university, went to the School of Slavonic Studies in London, which specialized in Central European history, language, culture. So I specifically wanted to go there. And then it all followed on from there. So I was that nerdy kid that used to go, not only did I never miss my own lectures, I used to go to other people's lectures because I found them interesting. So I was that guy. I was the annoying slightly maturer student than everyone else, who was just absolutely fascinated with everything that was going on.
So the pre-'89 history teachers will look at you and think,
what happened? Where did we go wrong?
Yeah. What did we do to trigger that? There should be an element of pride. Are you still in touch with any of your Burko?
It's funny. I get invited back there to sort of give lectures. I do a Holocaust lecture every year for their lower sixth, and on the back of that we do an essay writing competition. And I judge that. So I'm still quite involved. I guide their history tour, GCSE year history tour, to Berlin every year as well. So I've got a good connection to the history department there. So it's quite funny how I have been accepted back into the fold at Berkhamsted, which is quite nice. Yeah, I mean I keep repeating to them I was certainly not particularly welcome back in the mid-'80s when I was actually there, but I'm quite welcome now.
So your first books, so after you left uni, you went straight into being an author. So is that the case, or? Yeah,
pretty much. I did. I sort of fell in with Norman Davies, who was my lecturer in my third year, doing Polish history, and he was brilliant. And I ended up, and he asked me once after a tutorial, asked me to stay behind, and I thought I'd done something wrong, and he in a roundabout way ended up asking me if I'd like to do some work for him. And that sort of started, that was really a huge thing, because I ended up as his research assistant and then as his co-author. We wrote a book together called Microcosm that came out in 2002 on the history of Wrocław, a city now in Poland, used to be called Breslau, was in Germany, before that Prussia. So that was a very hugely formative, professional relationship with Norman. I'm still in touch with him now, and he's one of the sort of, elder statesmen of British history writing, really. So it's a tremendous apprenticeship.
Brilliant. And I suspect your First to Fight, which was your most recent book, actually, is long in the writing. I suspect, in terms of.
In a sense, I've sort of come full circle, because I started off with that fascination for Central Europe, as I said, and that became a bit more directed and more specific through Norman's influence to looking at Poland. And then I gravitated more towards where my skill set lay, which was German language. I speak German. I lived in Germany after I finished my degree. So I speak fluent German, and that's a tremendous benefit, obviously, for doing German history. I find it slightly problematical when people profess to be sort of experts in things that when they don't necessarily have the languages necessary. So that's that, as far as I'm concerned, I sort of tick that box. So I sort of gravitated towards doing German history, and I also find Third Reich I find fascinating. And probably for a slightly odd reason, a reason that most people wouldn't necessarily see, but it's more, what fascinates me is more the mechanics of it, because it's not, I think we have this is in a sense that underlies the book as well, the 100 Objects book. Our assumption on, when we talk about sort of these totalitarian regimes, is that they function primarily on terror and oppression. And certainly if you were a Pole in German-occupied Europe, or German-occupied Poland during the war, then it would primarily function on terror and oppression. But for the German people themselves, it's a crucial distinction. It's a seduction more than oppression. All the attributes, all of the sort of furniture of oppression is there. The secret police and the concentration camps and all the rest of it. But crucially, it doesn't function primarily on fear. It primarily functions on a seduction. And it's that aspect that I find the most fascinating. So I think, in a sense, that comes out, I think, in the book, where you look at propaganda and how the German people were sold this vision of a future Germany. This is what we're going to create for you. And it's a world of, subsidized radio, art technology, Volkswagen Beetles, it's all of that stuff. That's all part of the seduction. Yeah. And we have to appreciate that that's how it works.
It's a certain, and these days, I mean, actually, I'm going to read from Richard Overy's forward. Macabre fascination comes out of that, which is kind of extended it now. So his forward, I'm just going to read the first couple of sentences, actually. Hitler's Third Reich lasted only 12 years, yet it continues to exert a macabre fascination long after its violent demise. There is no other modern political movement and no other modern dictator that compete with the instant recognition of the images, symbols, and propaganda surrounding Hitler and his regime. And he starts with, and it's going to be the introduction straight into our first object. Of course, choosing 100 objects to define the Third Reich can never be an easy task. And there will be things here that readers think should be included, just as there are many objects that will be reassuringly familiar. So the first object I've selected, and it's actually two objects together, actually, and it refers to Adolf Hitler's love life, basically, which has a certain macabre fascination. The Geli Raubal bust, the bust of her face, her head, and also Eva Braun's lipstick case, which is phenomenal. And I'm not going to show the images on this presentation, but you can see the bust there, and the lipstick case, extraordinary piece there.
Yeah.
Where do you start? I mean, Geli Raubal, I had no idea she existed. Just tell us about her.
She's, I mean, very interesting. I think, underlying this, we kind of forget that, Hitler is a human being in a way. I think there's a lot of, by way of a sort of self-defense mechanism, we tend to, in the modern phrase, we tend to other him. And put him in a separate category of bad man, and on one level absolutely that's fair enough, but then we shouldn't forget that he's a human being, and bizarre things like he had a sex life, he had a wife at the end of the war, he had a mistress for a long time in Eva Braun. Whether he had carnal relations with Geli Raubal or not is still disputed. We don't know. There's an awful lot of sort of propaganda, black propaganda from the other side, from the political left in Germany, that kind of made all sorts of assertions about, that she was carrying his love child and all of this stuff. We just don't know the truth of his relationship with Geli Raubal. It was certainly unhealthy, but whether it was carnal or not,
was she buried or cremated?
Good question. I don't know, Ben. Actually, you've picked a massive hole right there.
Well, the thing is, if she's buried, if she's carrying a love child, maybe there's an element of I mean, that one could be answered. But she was his niece. Was quite a lot younger than him. He was her legal guardian at the time. This is before he came to power. She died in 1931. She committed suicide in 1931. And she lived with Hitler in his flat in Munich for a couple of years. And, she was seen out, she was very often on his arm when he went to events and so on. And she was very gregarious. She was, by all accounts, members of Hitler's entourage and so on will remember her very fondly and say how she used to light up a room and all of this sort of thing. She was very, very bubbly personality. And Hitler certainly had a sort of paternal interest or avuncular interest in her. Whether that went any further, we don't know, as I said, but it seems to have been, must have felt it quite oppressive. And she was then studying medicine at Munich University and decided that she wanted to throw that up and go and become a singer. And she wanted to go and live in Vienna and become a singer. And this was the sort of crisis that seems to have provoked her suicide. And again, it's quite difficult to separate the myth from the reality here, but it would appear, and we can surmise, that Hitler was not keen on the idea of her going off and becoming a singer, which rather it's sort of impecunious profession. So I think there probably was an argument between them, and he said, well, you bloody well stay in Munich and do your studies. And the next thing, whether it's a cry for help or whatever it is, she shoots herself with Hitler's pistol in the chest and actually perforates her heart.
and ends up bleeding to death in his flat, which is, as you can imagine, for someone like Hitler, who's then in 1931 is an up-and-coming politician. You know, he's no longer on the fringes, really. He's a very much the coming man in Germany in 1931. This is profoundly embarrassing. So, of course, this is political manner to the propaganda mills of the German left, who go on into overdrive and say that they're having this, affair, and it's incestuous, and she's carrying his love child, and all of this stuff, all of which there's no proof, but that's sort of become the established narrative.
No.
And it's fascinating, and then you see this bust, which is a one-off that he had commissioned at the time. And it shows you, I think, the depth of feeling that he had for her. And again, the precise nature of the relationship we don't know, but it's clear from that there is love there in some form, and it's I think it speaks to that element. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a remarkable piece, really. But it does speak to that sort of human side of someone who we traditionally like to say is inhuman or whatever. Someone as if Hitler, landed from outer space and is not one of us. That bust reminds us, I think, that Hitler's very much one of us and had all of those same human feelings that we have. Yeah,
and we're going to talk about his artistic background as well as part of that. But there's a sense of that in that. So Gelli's sort of appearances with Hitler are in complete contrast to the fact that Eva Braun was never seen with, or very rarely seen with him.
Yes, and it's interesting. I mean, Eva Braun sort of comes to the fore, I mean, in Hitler's life anyway, not long after Gelli's demise, and she was an assistant at Heinrich Hoffman's photograph studio, which another of the objects in the book is Hoffman's camera. Yeah. Hoffman was the sort of propaganda supremo, was Hitler's private photographer, and was a very good photographer. We can maybe talk about him later on. And Eva Braun worked in his photo studio, and Hitler obviously took a liking to her, and they started a relationship. But unlike Gelli Raubal, it was completely hidden from public view. So by that stage, Hitler effectively, I think, had learned the lesson. There's an interesting change in the way Hitler is promoted or presented to the German people after Gelli Raubal's death, because prior to that, he was sort of shown as an ordinary guy. In a sense, and then there's a shift to a much more sort of statesman-like image after Gelli Raubal's death, and it's partly because of that political fallout that damaged him. The rumor mill going into overdrive and all this talk of the love child and all the rest of it damaged him politically. So he tries to remain a little bit aloof from human matters from then on. And that's presented in the way he's shown to the German public. So for that reason, partly for that reason, Eva Braun is kept strictly secret right until 1945. Effectively until both of their deaths at the end of the war on the 30th of April. So that's why she's kept secret. But she's there, and anyone in Hitler's entourage and in the inner circle, they knew her very well. She was always sitting at dinner. She was always the hostess at the Berghof, Hitler's house up in Bavaria. So she was relatively well known for the inner circle, but just not to ordinary Germans at all. She was kept very much out of the limelight. And she's an interesting character as well. I mean, she was someone who she never strikes you as being, particularly profound or interesting. Albert Speer actually said of her that generations of historians will be disappointed by Eva Braun, which I think is quite a sort of a telling comment.
You focused on her lipstick case. Particular reason for that? There must be loads of other things.
There are, and these. I thought that was quite telling because she was someone. She was, for the style of the day, she was a beautiful woman. And she was rather to be honest, a bit of an empty vessel in a strange way, for that, the reason that I just said. There wasn't much going on, as far as we can tell, sort of upstairs. She was almost an adornment to Hitler in a sense, and that's the way he liked it. Now, these are different times. I know we're treading on eggshells these days, talking in this way about women in the public eye, but that's how it was. And Hitler wanted a woman on his arm who wouldn't answer back and didn't necessarily have any ideas and of her own, and agreed with everything he said. That's what he says as much. I think I quote it in the accompanying piece. That's how he viewed an ideal woman, effectively. And that's what she was. And in a sense, a sort of an empty lipstick case is kind of appropriate in that sense. She was a beautiful accessory to Hitler.
Yeah, metaphor.
That's effectively what she was. And it's again, I think the empty lipstick case is quite appropriate.
Let's move on because time is ticking. The next object, there's two objects that are linked together actually, 59 and 60. German-Soviet treaty border map. Now this is a part of history which clearly you've alluded to with your First to Fight, your latest. In fact, no, you alluded really more.
And the previous one.
Your Devil's Alliance, didn't you?
Yeah.
Which was kind of. But the other element is also the other item is the radio tower.
Yes,
from which now the German-Soviet treaty border map is a map that's literally got the signatures of both, the leading German, the leading Soviet of the time.
Yeah,
so
Stalin and
Ribbentrop and Stalin. Yeah. And that's a remarkable piece of evidence, a piece of history.
It is, absolutely. And it's still in the archive of the German Foreign Office.
Agreeing how they're going to divide Poland up as part of the start of the Second World War.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite remarkable. I think, there's a tendency, I think, in the popular mind and beyond, actually, to sort of read history backwards. And we saw this a little bit, I suppose, last week or week before, with the VE Day celebrations, and with the Soviet Union becomes part of the Grand Alliance in 1941, and we have to mention, of course, that the Soviet Union carries most of the human losses and material losses of the European theatre in combating Nazi Germany from 41 onwards. Right, 4 out of 5 German soldiers are killed by the Red Army in the Second World War. Wow, which is a remarkable statistic. And we have to say that, were it not for the Soviets being on our side in the Grand Alliance from 1941 onwards, I don't think the Western powers could have defeated Germany at all, because Germany was that strong. Yeah. So it does, play a crucial role, the Soviet Union. But prior to that, between 39 and 41, they're on the wrong side. They're on the German side. The Nazi-Soviet pact, which seems to be routinely ignored in the Western narrative of the war, I think it's crucially important, certainly for
and they both
explaining how the war starts.
And they both attacked Poland.
Yeah, I mean they're basically making alliance. There's various reasons for the Nazi-Soviet pact, and it's effectively an alliance. Before everyone writes in the notes underneath this video, it was never an alliance. It is effectively an alliance. It's not technically an alliance, but it is effectively. So de facto, if not de jure. There are various reasons for that to come about, economic not least, and sort of grand strategic, but a strong element of it is a shared antipathy towards Poland. And you can see that in that map, that they are dividing up Poland. They're literally taking a map of
pre-war. I can't see it, but there's the map.
There's the map.
And you've got the signatures of the two leaders there, Ribbentrop and Stalin.
Yeah. And they draw a black line down the middle and say,
"You basically have that following the river, isn't it? Going down."
Yeah. It's a succession of rivers, but and they literally draw a black line down the middle and say, "You have that bit, we'll have that bit." I mean, it's a remarkably cynical exercise. It's incredible, really, and that's the sort of the evidence of it. In that, it's quite shocking actually to those, I suppose, that are unfamiliar with the beginning of the war.
It's amazing how evenly Poland divided up, almost exactly in half.
Yeah.
Is the Poland today the same sort of border? Is it matched up to what it was before 39?
That becomes effectively. This is another point that people forget, but I mean, with some variations. But that line on that map is now effectively Poland's eastern frontier to Ukraine and Belarus. So that frontier remains. So obviously that was the frontier between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union between 39 and 41, and then the Germans go east and attack the Soviet Union, and you've got the major conflict of the war on the Eastern Front, and then it all sweeps back again, and Poland is reconstituted, but it's reconstituted effectively on Soviet terms. So the Soviets say, oh, by the way, that frontier that we drew in 39, we're keeping that.
Okay.
So Poland is then shifted westwards.
Shifted
that's what
westwards.
Poland is now.
So elements that were Germany are now Poland.
Exactly.
Okay.
So Silesia, Pomerania, East Prussia were taken by Poland, effectively in compensation for what they'd lost to the Soviets in 39.
Yeah.
So it's complicated. This is the thing about certainly Polish history, but Central European history generally. It's pretty complicated. You do have to bend your mind a little bit to sort of to make sense of it, but it's worth it.
Okay. And the other object I referred to, the how do you spell that? Gleiwitz radio tower is essentially where World War II starts. It
is. Again, remarkable story. You can go to Gleiwitz. It's now called Gliwice, and it's in southwest Poland. Nice little city, and the radio tower is still there with an accompanying museum. It's very much worth seeing. And the Gleiwitz incident, as it's known, is the 31st of August 1939. It's the night before the 1st of September, which is when the German tanks roll into Poland. And the Germans basically wanted to have an excuse to show the world that what they were doing was not naked aggression. It was in some way defensive, in some way justified. So they send in this, that was just on the German side of the frontier, but it's about sort of 3 miles away from the Polish frontier at the time. And they sent in an SS team pretending to be Polish to this radio station. Fired a few shots into the ceiling, tied up all of the staff, put them in the basement, and they wanted to proclaim some, incendiary message in Polish across the airwaves, which they effectively did, but it didn't quite work. So, you got the first, I think, 9 words of the message, and then the rest was just lost in static. But that was enough. That was job done as far as they were concerned. And then, the following day, the radio is talking about this unprovoked aggression by the Poles on German territory. The German press is saying the same thing, and it becomes effectively the reason for the war. So when Hitler stands up the following morning in the Reichstag in Berlin, he uses this classic line where he says, "Since 5:45 this morning, we are fighting back." That's the phrase he uses because he's referencing Gleiwitz.
Yeah,
he's saying we've been attacked by the Poles. So that gave them their in the legal sense, that gave them their casus belli, their reason for war. And it's a remarkable story, really. They left one unfortunate Pole, who's an entirely innocent man by the name of Franciszek Honiok, who was drugged and shot and left at the site, allegedly as proof that the Poles had done this, and he'd done absolutely nothing. He was just picked up by the Gestapo a couple of days before. He was an ethnic Pole living in Upper Silesia and then German territory.
Yeah.
And it's remarkable. You can see from that, extrapolate from that, you can see that the Nazi regime just viewed the Poles as expendable. They weren't human beings as far as they were concerned.
Remarkable. Right, let's move on. So, there's so many different objects we could focus on. The next one I've gone for is Sophie Scholl's matriculation card.
Yeah.
Now, for me, this opened my eyes in terms of understanding that there was an active resistance in Germany by Germans against the Nazi regime, so that was a real eye-opener to me. Explain more about this.
Yeah, I think people perhaps get us, in contrast to how you just teed that up, Ben, but I think most people have, they will mention Stauffenberg and the Stauffenberg bomb plot, and they will talk about the German resistance. They might have seen the films, they might have seen, like Valkyrie, the Tom Cruise film about Stauffenberg, for example. I think the idea of the German resistance is quite kind of widespread, but in a sense, what's remarkable is how small it was. This is a tiny fraction of the population that is actively resisting. So people like Stauffenberg, and this is a good example. So I do. There is an item there relating to Stauffenberg as well, because just to backtrack a bit with the book, I wanted to try and, through the objects, I wanted to try and tell as comprehensive a story of the Third Reich as possible, which means talking about, you know, that seduction, about propaganda, about, you know, the technology of the war and all of that, but also about subjects like resistance. So I wanted something for Stauffenberg, something for Sophie Scholl, because she's, you know, a member of the White Rose, which was this student organization, quite small, a resistance group in Munich University. And they, it's remarkable, they're remarkable because it is sort of wholly moral, their rejection and their revolt against Nazism. A couple of the members of the White Rose had served in the military already. They'd been sort of drafted, and they'd done a sort of tour of duty, or however they phrased it, on the Eastern Front. So they kind of knew what was going on. They could see that this was effectively a race war. There were crimes being committed every day, and so on. So they were pretty much in clear-eyed about what was going on, and that influences this small group of people to essentially write sort of clandestine leaflets. They were leafleteers, so they used to write these leaflets and sort of leave them around the university, and in the hope of spreading the word. But they know that if they get caught, you know, they're going to be face the full wrath of the Gestapo and the Soviet and the Nazi state. And they duly do get caught. I think, I forget which number of leaflet it was. I think, you know, 6 or 7, I think it was, down the line. And this is actually picked up by a janitor at Munich University, who actually sees the students dropping it. They drop them from the atrium. They get bolder and bolder as they're not being caught. And then this particular issue that they do, this particular leaflet, they drop them in, you know, from the top floor into the atrium of the university. So they're really provoking some sort of response. And they're seen by a janitor, who of course reports them to the Gestapo, and then the following day they're picked up and interrogated. And of course duly tried for treason and executed by the Nazi regime. But I mean, it's a remarkable story because it is, in essence, a moral revolt. There's not really a sort of political agenda that they're pushing. They're just saying these people are criminals. This regime is a criminal one, and we have to protest against it.
Yes.
And ordinarily, in a free society, that would just, there she is, Sophie Scholl.
That's Sophie, yeah.
Yeah. So it's remarkably brave. And bear in mind that people of that generation had grown up in the previous almost 10 years, gone through all of the institutions of you know, organizing Nazi childhood, the Hitler Youth and all the rest of it, through all of the indoctrination. And people like Sophie Scholl still had the moral clarity to say this is wrong. And I think that's remarkable and should be lauded.
No, very impressive. Right, let's move on to our fourth one. Bear with me whilst I. So we referred to it earlier. Actually, it was Henrik Hoffman's Leica. So yeah. I mean, obviously, it's like having your official photographer following you around from how early? The early 30s, was it? That Hoffman and Adolf
earlier
Hitler.
Than that. God, earlier than that. And it's a remarkable story. Hoffman. He was already an established photographer in Munich. He's a very good photographer, actually. I mean, a lot of, if you search Google and you look for Hitler images, most of what you're looking at that comes up is going to be a Hoffman picture. So, you know, very prolific, and he's a brilliant photographer. He's right up there with, you know, sort of Cartier-Bresson and Robert Capa and all of those people, you know, at the very beginnings of photojournalism. This is what Hoffman is doing. He's doing photojournalism. People like Cartier-Bresson and Robert Capa, is because he was doing it for the wrong side, right? But he's a remarkable photographer. Anyway, he was already established in Munich already before Hitler, you know, Hitler's rise. And Hitler had this policy right at the beginning of his career, so in the early 1920s, where he tried to limit exposure of his own image, to create some sort of kudos and create some sort of mystique around himself. So he used to send his thugs out, his brown shirts, to sort of, if he saw someone taking his picture, he used to send the thugs to go and beat them up and take the camera, right? Because he wanted to ration the image. And Hoffman, as I said, was an established photographer, sort of received this commission from America. And I think this was 1920, it's that early, where the commission says, oh, we've heard about this mysterious politician, can you get his picture? You know, and he says, yeah, I can do that. You know, it's a large sum of money, so I'll go and do that. And he goes and does it, and promptly is beaten up by Hitler's thugs. And he sort of thinks this is strange, and tries to arranges an interview with Hitler and says, well, what's going on? You know, why can't we, you know, I'm sure we can come to a deal where I can make money out of you, and I'll benefit you with the exposure. And it sort of changes Hitler's mind about how to use his image. So rather than ration it, to actually go the other way. Right. And Hoffman, you know, they enter into a sort of a mutually beneficial relationship that Hoffman effectively coaches Hitler on, and a lot of the sort of movements and gestures and histrionics, literally, that he used to use in his speeches. So there's lots of pictures. I think a couple of them might be, are in the book from memory, taken in the studio, where Hoffman sort of gets Hitler to do these gesticulations, and he takes the picture, and then you can imagine them showing the pictures later on and saying, well, this particular gesture doesn't really work, so don't do that again. Whereas this one is really powerful, so do that. Right. So he's really coaching Hitler on the presentation of his image, and the same thing with how he dresses. Now, there are lots of stills in Hitler's archive of Hitler in various uniforms and various outfits, and again, you can imagine them going through and saying that works, that doesn't. So it's really a hugely symbiotic relationship where Hoffman helps Hitler to hone his public image, and at the same time becomes a very rich man in the process. So all of those photographs that were released to the press and so on, you know, were Hoffman's copyright. And even you know, by the time you get past 1933 and Hitler comes to power, even the bust of Hitler that is on German definitive stamps in the 1930s is a Hoffman image. So every German definitive stamp of the 1930s was paying a royalty to Hoffman. It's remarkable. So he's a remarkable businessman as well as a photographer.
And did he carry on as a photographer after the war?
No, he was. I mean, he's not. It's interesting that he is effectively damned by his relationship to Hitler, professional and personal. And he is stripped of all of his possessions. All of his archive is taken by the Americans. Ends up in the National Archive in Washington. It's all still there. This is why it's all free to air and it's all on the internet. So he was effectively stripped of everything through that connection with Hitler. And he was quite old by then. So he died, I think, from memory in the mid 1950s. So from after 1945, he just sort of, you know, quietly disappeared, complaining about his loss of income and his loss of his archive and so on. But I mean, it's a remarkable relationship, and it's one that doesn't get, I think, enough scrutiny, because Hoffman is crucial in creating the image of Hitler, and some of his work is utterly remarkable. And it not only is interesting in that sense, in a sort of political and historical sense, but it's artistically very good as well, very, very strong. So he's a brilliant photographer.
If Nazism and the Nazi right was successful at one thing, it was branding. I mean, the branding and marketing is a hell of a brand campaign.
Absolutely, yeah. And the thing is, we think that Hitler didn't really do this stuff. I think there's a popular perception, that Hitler was a kind of a straight up, you know, slightly very lunatic politician who didn't really bother with sort of images and his public image and all that. But he absolutely does. And people like Hoffman are instrumental in doing that and honing that public image.
Right, we've just gone over the half hour, so I've got two more I'd like to deal with. One is the Volkswagen Beetle, which I think younger generations will have no idea of the origins of the Volkswagen. It was a Hitler creation, and that also feeds to his creative background. He was an artist, and so my knowledge is that, you know, Hitler sat down with some people and said, I'd like a people's car, and I'd like it to look like this, and almost drew it himself. And then the Volkswagen was created. Is that the truth?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it always amazed me when, you remember a couple of years ago, there was this emissions scandal and VW got it in the neck for having, been fiddling the emissions data for years and years. And I remember it was such a big scandal, and VW was, for a while they were saying that the company might collapse and so on. And I remember thinking at the time, and I think I wrote a blog piece about it as well, I found it remarkable that, it's a company that might feasibly go down because of this scandal, and yet its origins are, so intimately bound up with the Third Reich and Hitler in person, that surely that's the biggest scandal that everyone seems to have forgotten. I mean,
if you can survive World War II, surely
absolutely,
emissions thing.
So this is part of, as I said earlier on, this is part of that sort of grand sell, that grand seduction of the German people. The Nazi regime was selling the German people effectively a new society. This was the world that, this is modernizing. People talk about Nazism as being fundamentally conservative and backward looking, but I mean, on one level it is, but it's also profoundly modernist and profoundly forward looking. So they are talking about this, creating, a new Jerusalem, and everyone's going to be equal, and it won't matter whether you come from East Prussia or the Rhineland, and whether you're old nobility or a worker from Dortmund. You're all the same. You're all Germans, and this is the world we're creating. And it's a world of, we're all going to be driving Volkswagen Beetles down the Autobahn, and this was the seduction, and it's an essential part of it. And the VW was essentially Hitler's baby. He wanted, as part of this vision, to bring motoring to the masses. This was a sort of a keystone of the modern society that he wanted to create.
Yeah.
So the brief was given by Hitler. Effectively, it was to be marketed. It was to take, have 4 seats and have a economical engine, and it would had to retail, I think, at 995 Reichsmarks, which was a fraction of the price of a normal car at the time. So it really was trying to bring motoring to the masses. Of course, none of this actually transpires, because the way it used to work was that if you signed up for this, a little bit like sort of subscription service, you had to collect the stamps, you had to pay your dues, you'd sign up and you'd pay a proportion of your wages over every month, and you'd keep the details of those payments in a little booklet. And once it was all paid off, and some people of our sort of age, Ben, we remember Green Shield stamps, right? It worked in the same way. The younger generation won't know what we're talking about. But it worked in the same way. You pay your dues and you keep the details in a little book. And then when you're paid up, you get your car, right? But of course, by the time the cars are ready, Hitler gets a Volkswagen Beetle for his birthday, for his 50th birthday, in April 1939, but none of the other Volkswagen Beetles are ever delivered, because of course the war intervenes. So all of those payments that have gone into the system just disappear into the financing the German war, and none of those Beetles are ever delivered. So it becomes it's viewed almost like it's a con trick. But I think that's actually too cynical. It's hard to be too cynical about the Third Reich, but in that case, I think it is, because it is, in its origin, it's an essential part of that sell, of that seduction of the German people. This is the new world that we're creating for you. Yes. So it's very significant.
Good. And so let's do the last one now. And probably people will have a go at me which ones I chose, but the last one it's another pair of them combined, and it's Göring's telegram and Göring's cyanide capsule, which is a particularly you can see with the glass vial bitten off there. It's for me, these define the kind of almost the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The panic that's going on, and the tone of the telegram, and the way that Göring was treated. Almost demonstrates just how the panic that must have been going on back in Berlin. Yeah,
it's an interesting point. The first one to talk about the telegram. So Göring's telegram. Göring was down in Berchtesgaden, down this sort of complex of buildings and so on, down to the far southwestern corner of Germany. southeastern corner of Germany. And he was there while Hitler was ensconced in the bunker in Berlin. And as Berlin was being surrounded by the Red Army, Goering effectively writes this telegram to Hitler saying, given that I am traditionally the deputy, your deputy as in all of your positions, if your freedom of action is inhibited by this Soviet action, can I assume that I can take control? So it's actually it's a reasonably sensible and thoughtful telegram, but that's not how it's read when it arrives in Berlin. And you have to bear in mind that the upper echelons of the Nazi state, if you were going to use any sort of metaphor to describe them, you'd describe it as starving rats fighting in a sack. It's dog eat dog doesn't come close. So people like Martin Bormann, who very often, to the later end of the war, has Hitler's ear, is a sort of slightly crazed conspiracist about everybody. He hates everybody, and everybody hates him. And there are sort of conspiracies around every corner, and it's always literally that idea of rats fighting in a sack is quite apt. So obviously, when this telegram arrives, then Hitler, who is already at his wit's end because he can see that the writing is on the wall, reacts with Bormann in his ear, as you can imagine, saying, "This is treason, mein Führer." Hitler reacts by basically stripping Goering of all of his offices and saying, "This is an attempt at a seizure of power, and how dare you? And I'm sending the SS to arrest you." And it's interesting that all of the or many of the senior members of the entourage, so Himmler also falls out with Hitler because he actually wants to try and make some contact with the Western Allies to make some sort of deal, which Hitler doesn't want to have happen. So Hitler is really burning a lot of bridges with some of his oldest and dearest comrades at this point, and Goering is one of those that suffers in the same way. So that telegram is interesting because it illustrates that nature of, particularly the demise of the Third Reich, that dog-eat-dog nature of the upper echelons. And the cyanide capsule, I think, is just, I think it's one of the most remarkable items in the book. And it's remarkable because it just boggles the mind to think how did that thing survive? That little glass vial and the brass casing that was held in. How did that survive so long to still be with us today? It's quite remarkable. And that was, Goering was the most prominent of the defendants at the Nuremberg Tribunal, which ran from late 45 until late 46. It was almost inevitable that he would be found guilty on all counts, which he was. All 4 counts he was found guilty on. He actually was the most impressive of all of the 16 defendants at Nuremberg. He was clean for the first time in a long time. He'd had a sort of low-level morphine addiction for a long time, and showed some quite peculiar behaviors during the period of the Third Reich. But when he was captured by the Americans, they effectively got him clean for the first time, and he showed a little bit, I suppose, of the mettle of the old Goering. He was a war hero from the First World War. He was one of the German flying aces from the First World War. So he was someone who had he had something about him, personal bravery, integrity, whatever it is. There was certainly something about Goering. He wasn't just, a man from the street, one of the sort of the thuggish side of the Third Reich. He was someone who had some substance, and that comes through in the Nuremberg trials, because he's very good at deflecting, at answering back to the accusations made towards him and others. And he became a real thorn in the side of the prosecutors. They weren't prepared for him to be as good as he was in defending himself at Nuremberg. And at the end of it, of course, as I said, he's found guilty, sentenced to death. And he says, this is they were due to be hanged. And he said, this is a very disgraceful end. And he wanted a soldier's end. So he asked to be shot, which they refused. And then the night before they were all due to be hanged, he's found in his cell having taken cyanide and kills himself. So he cheats the hangman, but that was a deliberate thing. The big question is how he got the cyanide, which has never really been cleared up. There are a few theories as to how it was smuggled in, whether it was deliberate or unwitting. It might have been smuggled in by or passed to him in a clandestine manner by a German guard. So that's quite plausible, but we just don't know. It's just not clear at the moment. So it's a fascinating story, and as I said, it's one of those things that it's just amazing that object itself has survived.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
So, in summary, we've got the paperback of Roger's book is now out. We've got a few of them in the bookshop. I'll probably close with another summary, actually, so I won't go into too much. I found it absolutely fascinating, and I think anybody who perhaps hasn't read into the World War II and the Nazi Reich in much depth, this gives you an absolute brilliance cover for all the war. Read this and you're a dinner party expert, frankly. So and what you probably also find is you will find the next thing of interest that will perhaps divert your own research if you're interested in getting into stuff. So and it's just very easily digested as well. So Roger, well done. It's a really, really great book. And thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Massive thanks to Roger for that wonderful interview carried out earlier today. And you can obviously get the book from the shop. We're here every day of the week except Sundays. Give us a call on 01442 827 653. Further order details are in the text below this video. So we've got other videos in production, other author interviews. I'll give you a little sneak a glimpse into one or two of them. So Laura Brand and her book, The Joy Journal for Magical Everyday Play. Got Laura talking to Willow Crossley. So a little bit of a double header. The Wild Journey, a year of nurturing yourself through nature. So that's one that's in production. Robin Ince, I spoke to him earlier today. We've got a few ideas. This is his book from 2 years ago, I'm a Joke and So Are You. A comedian's take on what makes us human, a very honest assessment. And another one in production as well. Richard Atkinson wrote Mr. Atkinson's Rum Contract, which Richard has been involved in publishing for years, working for Bloomsbury and Penguin, and this is published by HarperCollins. So a very, very, it's a book he had to write, a story of a tangled inheritance. And then finally, currently just in discussion with Saul David, and I think Roger will interview him as well. His new book is called Crucible of Hell, which is Okinawa, the last great battle of the Second World War, which I think historians probably watching this, history fans watching this video will probably be quite keen on that one. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really enjoying producing these little films, and we'll have plenty more to come, so watch this space.